Right, so what we're going to do first, we're going to talk about the O2R routing, and we want to talk about the routing from the input path into the computer DAW, and then into the monitor path, so we can listen to it. And it's very similar to what we were doing with the. It's very similar to what we did on the Audient. So with the Audient, you've got the monitor path and the input path and all that stuff, and the O2R, you also have a monitor path, input path, and a monitor path, and it's exactly the same. It's just how you do it is slightly different. So if we go look right here at the signal layout, full signal layout one here, and this one here, let me just do this so I can switch back and forth between these. So on your input path, remember you've got your microphone or whatever you're recording plugged into an XLR cable, plugged into the studio bay, like in this case it's going to be into control room D. And then in the control room, you're going to have the patch bay. Studio E, mic 1, is going to go into the patch bay mic line preamp. Now this is the only thing that's a little bit different. In the O2R, you do have to patch the cables in, even if it's like right there in front of you. And then the O2R, the meter bridge, we're going to set that for pre-EQ. Now I did mention that the other day really briefly. And then, but what we want to do is we want to set that meter bridge for pre-EQ. Remember there's a button up there, and you're going to see this when you get in there. And if you don't remember it, there's a button on top that says pre-EQ and pre-fader and then post-fader. And, or pre-effects and then post-effects and then post-fader. So you get those three options there, and the ones we're really going to be using mostly are pre-EQ and then post-fader, right? And that's post-fader is going to be for your monitor path for mixing, and pre-EQ is going to be for your input path for level setting. And then you want to adjust the input gain, and you turn on the phantom power if you need to. And then you're going to push the layer 1 through 24 button. Now the layer 1 through 24 button is your input path. Remember there's the 4 layers, 1 through 24, 25 through 48, master layer, and then remote. And that 1 through 24 button is for your input path. Make sure your fader mode is set for fader, select channel 1, turn your fader up, control room level up. At this point you should be hearing signal. And that's the overview of how all that works in the very beginning there. And let's just go ahead and take a look. What is up, Walter? How you doing? Let me go ahead and open up this here. So this is what we're talking about here is right in here. All this stuff here. I'm going to zoom in on this. Okay, so right up here, the meter bridge is this part right here, and you can see it has pre-EQ, pre-fader, and post-fader. Pre-EQ and post-fader are the ones we're going to be working on mostly. Pre-EQ is for your level setting. You're going to push this button to select between them. And then you've got your phantom power here across the top. You've got your pad if you need it. And then you've got your gain right there for your preamp. And with that, you're going to set the level there, and you can see the level here in your meter to make sure you're not clipping, make sure you're not going in too hot. So you've got that there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go down here and press the layer button for 1 through 24 because that's our input path. And we need to hear the signal. We need to make sure we're hearing the signal nice and loud. So then what we'll do is we'll go in to the channel we're on, whatever channel we plugged into, and we're going to bring the fader up. Now, everything else should be up. You should have your stereo set to 0 here, and then you've got your control room. You can pull that up before you do all this stuff if you want, which is kind of how I recommend to do it usually. Pull up your control room level here, and at this point we should be hearing signal as long as everything else is set correctly. And the reason why I'm glossing over that other stuff is because all that other stuff with the setting, stereo to 0 and having like your control room set for stereo, all that stuff is stuff we do in the mix settings as well. So we're talking about the input settings here, but if you've already been mixing a song and you're just bringing something in, then it's already going to be set. So we want to hear that signal there to make sure that it's the right signal. So we're going to bring up the channel here until we can hear it. If it's a trumpet, we're going to hear trumpet sounds. If it's a vocal, we're going to hear vocal sounds. If it's a drum, we're going to hear drum sounds, whatever it is. And that's what we're going to be seeing right here, we're going to be hearing it with this going on like this. So that should be something that we can hear, and at that point we're good to go. And that kind of brings us into what we need to be talking about today, which is the O2R routing. Now this routing section here is the next step in the puzzle. We haven't talked about this at all. The routing section here, we've got a couple of different things. We've got stereo, we've got direct, we've got our buses, and we've got our follow pan, 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. So number 1 is the stereo button, and this sends the track signal to the stereo mix bus. This is like pushing the mix button on the Audient or any other board. On the Mackie, if you were in the Mackie yesterday, it's that left-right button, sends it to the main mix. On the O2R, it's the stereo button. On the Audient, it's the mix button. And they all do the same thing, which is send the signal to the stereo mix bus. On the O2R, this is on by default. When you're zeroing out the board on the Mackie, it's going to be off. On here, it's on by default. Number 2 is the direct button. Now, the direct button is what you're going to use if you're going on the input path and you're recording into your DAW. The direct button sends the signal to the channel's direct out to the multi-track recorder. So in this case here, it's channel by channel. So whatever channel you're on is what it's going to be going into the computer. So if I'm on channel 1 on the O2R, it's going to go into input number 1 on the computer. In this case here, we press the direct button. Make sure you do not have the direct button and the stereo button pressed at the same time. It's not going to cause a feedback loop, but it will cause double monitoring eventually. So whenever you turn on that direct button, just go ahead and turn the stereo button off. You can do it before you turn it on or after you turn it on. It doesn't matter because it's not a feedback loop, but you don't want to be using both of them at the same time. Now, if we are on the monitor path, we're going to use these 1 through 8 buttons here for subgroup mixing. And this is, I'm going to come back to this because this is separate from the input path side of things. And same thing with number 4. So 3 and 4, we're going to come back to those to talk about those a little bit later. So if we're recording to the multi-track recorder, on the O2R, set the input level. In the routing section, engage the direct button for the channel, and then disengage the stereo button for the channel. On Pro Tools or Logic or whatever, set up a track on the input, set it for digital 1 if you're on channel 1, digital output set for digital 1 if you're on channel 1. This should be whatever channel is on the O2R. So if it's channel 1, it's going to be, digital 1 on your track on Pro Tools or input 1. And if it's channel 5, it'll be input 5 or channel 10, input 10, whatever. Engage the input monitoring for the track, that little I button in Pro Tools. And then layer 25 through 48, and then we're going to go back to the O2R, and then we're going to switch over to layer 25 through 48 and bring up the fader for their correct channel. Now, if we're over here and we're looking at this here, each channel is going to have a routing section. And remember, they're always going to be set to stereo mix by default. The stereo button is always going to be on by default. So when we are doing our input monitoring and we set the signal and we're ready to go and we turn it up and we hear it, that sounds great. We can just unpush the stereo button. We're going to stop hearing it. As long as that direct button is pressed, it's going to be feeding into Pro Tools in our computer. Make sure that you're feeding into Pro Tools in the computer. And then once we get out of the computer and we're coming back into the O2R, all you have to do is go to the layer and turn that layer up. You do not need to actually do anything more than that. You just need to turn that layer up because the stereo button is already pressed. And as long as you turn that channel up on that layer, you'll be good to go. So that's what's going on right here. So on layer 25 through 48, bring the fader up for the correct channel. Remember, the stereo button is on by default. So let's just go through that one more time. You're going to set your input level, use the phantom power if you need to, turn up that gain knob there, and we're good to go there. The routing section, engage the direct button, which is number 2 right here, disengage the stereo button for that channel. Now remember, to set your routing section here, remember there's 2 things you have to be aware of. You have to be aware of what layer you're on, which is layer 1 through 24, and you also have to be aware of what channel you're on. You have to push the channel select button for that channel, and that's why that's right over here in this one here. Let's go back over to this one. It's got all that stuff right here. So if you go into the O2R and you want to learn, if you want to go ahead and do record a microphone or something like that, Just go through these steps one by one. It's actually really easy ish if you just take the PDF in there and read through that as you do it. If you just go through these steps one by one, there might be a couple of little questions in there, but all the big things are covered. So push the layer 1 to 24 button, put the fader mode into fader, push the select button on whatever channel you're on and turn that fader up. And then the control room level, make sure that's up, and then you should be hearing signal from the input path. Routing it to the DAW, go into your routing section because we already pushed the select button. We've already got the channel selected. So you're going to go into your routing section here and go to turn your direct on and your stereo off. Direct button on, stereo button off. In the DAW, let me just go over here and show you that again. That's this one right here. Direct button on, stereo off. On the DAW, channel in should be ADAT1 or digital 1 or whatever it is. If you're in a different studio, it'll be maybe something a little bit different. But ADAT1 input, ADAT1 output, have those set to be the same thing. Make sure your input monitoring is set for on. Then go back to the O2R and push the layer 25 through 48 button. Make sure your meter is set for post fader because now we're checking the meters on actually after the faders. Then select channel 25 because channel 1 on the monitor path, if we're coming into channel 1, on the input path, if we're coming into channel 1, the monitor path is going to channel 25. So the monitor path, input path channel 1, monitor path channel 25. Then turn that fader up, and now we should be hearing signal from the monitor path. If anything is wrong, if you're not hearing a signal, places to check is your DAW. Make sure the input and the output are set the same. Make sure that the input monitoring is turned on so it's passing the signal through. That's the kind of stuff we want to check in Pro Tools or Logic. They both have that I button there. If you're not getting signal into Pro Tools, the first thing I would check is the routing section here. The direct button, turn it on, the stereo button, turn it off. Usually the problem there is that people have selected the wrong channel. If you have not pushed the layer button correctly and you didn't push the select button for the channel, you're not going to be, you've actually turned this direct on and the stereo off for the wrong channel. And that happens. That's happened to me a few times. It's going to happen to you a few times. The thing to remember is not that you're going to make a mistake. That's okay to make a mistake. It's how to get out of that mistake as quickly as possible. And that's really what we're trying to kind of accomplish here, is that when something's not working correctly, how can we make it work correctly as quickly as possible? So if you are not getting any signal into your computer, the first thing to check is the routing section. And if the routing section looks correct, make sure you're actually on the right channel. Because if you look at the routing section, you're like, yeah, the direct is on, the stereo is off, it seems like it should be fine. Probably you've got that set up for the wrong channel because you didn't push the layer button or you didn't push the select button. So common mistakes are people don't push that layer button, so they're on channel 25 when they think they're on channel 1. Or people just didn't push the select button at all on a channel, so they're on channel 10. They're looking at channel 1, but they're actually selected channel 10 just because they haven't pushed the select button. And that's happened to me as well, where I've been like, okay, I'm on channel 1. I just start making changes. My brain was on channel 1, but the board was physically on channel 10, right? So just be aware of that. Now, we did talk about this the other day. Let's talk about this again, and we're going to go over it with the notes here as well. Internal reverb setup. Remember, if there's 4 internal effects, they're all stereo, normal to aux sends, and they're normal back into channels 49 through 56. So if we're going to add a reverb to our vocal or our snare drum or whatever, in this case it's a snare drum on channel 2. If the snare drum is on channel 2 in Logic or Pro Tools or whatever, it will come to O2R on channel 26. Remember, layer 25 through 40 is the monitor path. So if I want to send that to a reverb, make sure aux 1 is selected, or if you're going into effect number 2, it's going to be aux 3. If you're going into effect number 3, it's going to be aux 5, and effect 4 would be aux 6, the way we have it set up at SAE. And you just make sure that aux is selected, change the fader mode to aux, go ahead and turn that fader up for the right one. Make sure you're on the correct layer, which would be 25 through 48. Put the layer up to 0, just so we just have it there. You don't need to do it for both auxes. You can if you want, because I think it's just set for like a mono input. And then add reverb to the snare. On the master layer, change the fader mode to fader, and then turn that up for 49 and 50. I would go ahead and link them before you do that. Pan them left and right because the reverb is stereo on the output side. And then you're good to go. At that point, you should be hearing reverb. Now, remember that the reverb we're talking about right now is on the monitor path. We're not actually going to be recording that reverb. And we don't have any real way to record that reverb unless we did some patching on the patch bay, which I've actually never done, but it would be a good little thing to kind of mess around with and see if you can figure out how to do that. Now let's go back here and talk about the routing section again. We just finished talking about the input path, how we can get a recording going, but I want to talk for a second about the routing section again in terms of the monitor path, and if we want to do some subgrouping. So I saw quite a lot of y'all had turned in the reflection discussion for the subgrouping, which is great, although I did push the due date back a couple of weeks because we haven't talked about it in class. And I would like to say that I was very impressed with the responses that I'd gotten. It shows that some of y'all really did your homework and you researched on the web about what subgrouping is, or you've been paying attention in class to talking about subgrouping, something like that. But every response I got was fantastic, and it talked about what is the point of subgrouping and how to do it. And it's great because we haven't even talked about it in class yet. So we will do a deep dive into it, and any questions that came up for you will be answered when we get to it, and that's going to be maybe this coming week or the week after. I forget exactly when. But when we're talking about subgrouping on here, on the O2R, what we're going to do subgrouping is to send the signal to the buses. Now remember, subgrouping, as we kind of mentioned briefly in one of the other classes, just so you can get a group of instruments and kind of mix them together, kind of get them going together. So what we need to do is, when we're doing the subgrouping here in the O2R, we need to make sure we're not sending the signal to the master out, to the mix bus. So we're going to turn off the stereo button, and we're going to push the pair for whatever buses we want to go to in here, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whichever ones we want to go to. We're going to push that. And then so that's step number 2, engage the routing numbers for the buses you want to send to. And then if you want to pan the signal, engage the follow pan button, and then go to the master layer and check the bus levels, and then link the bus channels if needed, and then pan the bus channels if needed. And then go to the bus to stereo page in the routing section and turn the bus channels on. And that's it. I know it's like a few steps in here. It's like, wait, hold on a second. So let's just go back and look at this like kind of step by step. Now, it's really useful that see, is it in my recents? No. Okay, here. Let's go into this here and see, where's my... Let's see here, it's O2R PowerPoint is what it's called. There we go. Cool. I'm just going to open one of these up. Doesn't matter which one. Okay, there we go. So this here... There we go. Get that nice and big so we can see it. And I'm going to just scroll through because this here has a good part about the busing here. And this is, again, is something that you have on Canvas. Okay, so let's see here. Sending it there. It literally talks about sending the signal to a bus. Yes, here we go. Sending bus outs to the stereo out, and then sending bus outs to the stereo out, and sending the signal to the bus. So, wait, that doesn't. Does that do it? Hold on a second. No. Go back here. Well, this is something we need to. Well, we do need to talk about. So if we're sending the stuff to the bus section here, we need to make sure our buses are set up to go to the main output, the mix stereo out. So we get to go to the bus stereo library, and go to the stereo out settings, and then go in here. So selected channel routing display, bus button to locate the bus to stereo page. And then in here, so if we go, the page we're talking about here is this one here, routing section here. This display button right here. There we go. Yeah, cool. So this display button right here, that's what we want to press. Press that button, and then that's going to bring you to this page. If you use the tabs on the bottom of the little screen, the little F1 through F4 keys, you click that, so it says bus to stereo here, and you have to actually turn it on. See that right there? See how it says on? You have to turn it on, and you probably want to pan it as well. Now, the weird thing is there are faders there, but they don't actually represent what's on the screen here. So really, you're going to have to go through and do this kind of by hand to turn them on, and then you can use the faders, but you're not going to see it reflected here on the screen. So you can use those faders, but it's, I don't know, the setup is kind of strange. And the encoder knobs do not control the pan on this. Like it's basically disconnected from the faders there. So you have to do it all by hand in here until you're actually just adjusting the level. So you pan it left and right, make sure you turn them on, which you have to go and you have to actually navigate using the cursor keys to click through. And then so it says here, use the cursor buttons to select the parameters and use the parameter wheel, increase, decrease, and enter buttons to set them. So panning, these controls are used to pan the bus out signals between the left and the right stereo output buses. And you can set them to the center by hitting the zero, by pressing enter on them as well. That'll zero it out. But you can, I would just pan them left and right unless you need it to be mono for some reason. On off, you're going to navigate down and hit the enter key on it to turn it on and off. And then the faders set the bus out to stereo out levels. Fader knobs appear highlighted when the faders are set to 0, 0, 0. So, and then you can use the scroll wheel to set that up. But then after that, you can use those faders. And you can actually pair them together, but it's not going to work the same way as your other channels. I'm not exactly sure why it's like that, but that's how it is. If you want to view these here, can be viewed on the view pages, see viewing channel parameter settings. And this is all in the manual here, and viewing channel fader settings on page 130 for more information. And you can name them as well, but I never ever get that far. Like I never worry about sending stuff out. Like I never worry about naming my buses. It's just bus 1, because it's not the same as in Pro Tools where you're actually looking at all these channels in front of you and you can see all the names. It's not like that. So let's go back over here and just this routing display here. So when you press that button that was in the router here, right over, where's my picture? There you are. The button we're talking about is right over here in this picture. I'm just trying to, there we go. So this area here, when you press that, oops, it's going to bring you to this routing display here. And we can see F1, F2, F3, F4, channel 1 through 24, channel 25 through 48, 49 through 56, bus to stereo. This is going to show you what all your channels are doing. So if you're on the input path, you're going to actually see these all set to D here, not S. S is, remember, stereo mode, and D is direct mode. So we're going to set those to stereo, and then we can also set our buses here. You can see here, you go into channel 25 through 48, and then you just press those buttons. But you can also use the navigation buttons to go to different ones here. So stereo, this button routes the selected input channel to the stereo out. Direct, this button routes the selected input channel to its direct out. And then we have, of course, surround sound mode. It's not commonly used, but we can configure it to have active surround outputs from either the bus's slots or the Omni outs. So that's what you want to do there, and then you're going to use these 1 through 8 buttons here to send it to your buses. And you can see across the top up here where it says all stereo, all bus, or all clear. You can set everything back to all bus. You just navigate up there with the little arrow keys and set them to all stereo, and it'll just put everything back to its kind of 0 default mode. So that's that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording there.